So we've spent the prior segments looking at the self. Now we're going to look at personality and consumer psychology. The definition of personality is individual differences that are durable and pervasive ways of being. Durable, so not a phase you're going through. In other words, are relatively durable over time. That is relative to your cohort over time. And pervasive over situations. So you're not just that way at work or school or with your family or within romantic relationships or when you're playing. It pervades all areas of your life. So personality is individual differences that are durable and pervasive ways of being. Your book is quite behind in its representation of personality psychology, which it claims is of low reliability and validity, including personality tests. In the author's defense, they are not psychologists. So remember, your book is written from a marketing perspective. Those who've taken personality psychology know that the referenced critiques, best stated by a personality psychologist himself, Walter Mischel, were once valid but were resolved long ago with things like aggregation techniques, proper use of personality tests, and by examining personality along with the social situation. So you don't need to memorize all that. Just know that the important thing to remember here is that professional personality tests, those endorsed by the American Psychological Association and used in the field of personality psychology, when used for their intended purposes, show high reliability and validity. So yes, there is much we can learn about consumer psychology from personality psychology. Here's a good critical thinking review question for you. We are all influenced by our personalities and the situations we are in. But for which do you think the situation has relatively more influence, high or low self-monitors? You might want to pause the video here for a moment, see if you can think of it. And the answer is high. If you didn't get that right, you might want to go back to the prior segment and review self-monitoring. If you did get it right, kudos. So we tend to think of personality traits as adjectives that describe durable and pervasive ways of being. For instance, extroverted, kind, faithful, cautious, dishonest, argumentative, fun-loving, spontaneous, etc. How many personality traits, in other words, adjectives that describe durable and pervasive ways of being, do you think there are in the English language? There are actually over 4,000. Traits are a major part of how we describe personality. But if you've taken personality psychology, you know that personality also includes things like our needs, preferences, and styles. However, for purposes of this class, we are going to focus on traits. Over 4,000 traits would be a little difficult to handle, right? Fortunately, however, 5 clusters of traits have been identified to be particularly successful in capturing and predicting individual differences in behavior. And these are called the Big Five. The 5-factor model depicted here on this slide is the most prominent, valid, reliable, and prolific model in personality psychology today. So let's start with neuroticism. If we describe somebody as high on neuroticism, we're saying that they are worried, insecure, nervous, and unsure. Those are great ways of describing that. Worried, insecure, nervous, and unsure. And with this one and the other 4 that we're going to look at, if they are low in this trait, they are the opposite, right? Now, extroversion. If somebody is high in extroversion, they tend to be outgoing, sociable, talkative, and energetic. Now, if they're low in extroversion, instead of calling it that, it has its own term. Do you know what that term is? And it is called introversion. Okay? Openness, okay, describes openness to different experiences and different ideas. Those are your first two things. Let's pause here for a moment, because when we say different, that's really important. Different experiences, different ideas. So we're talking about openness to different ideas, different than your own, in, say, religion or politics. The other two I'll give you with openness are explorative and independent thinking. Explorative and independent thinking. Agreeableness. Now, understand this is completely different than extroversion. Sometimes people think that this is part of extroversion, but I'm sure you can think of a case of someone who is really extroverted, kind of in your face, but not very nice. Okay? So if somebody is high in agreeableness, they tend to be nice, right? They tend to be warm, caring, nurturing, and nice. If someone is high in conscientiousness, they tend to be very detail-oriented, very careful, very organized, very reliable. Models like the five-factor model allow marketers and consumer researchers to segment populations by traits. For instance, research with the five-factor model has found two groups who are especially vulnerable to compulsive buying. And when we say compulsive buying, we're talking about the tendency to buy things you don't really need. The most vulnerable personality segments are those who are low in conscientiousness and high in agreeableness, but for very different reasons. Why might someone low in conscientiousness be especially vulnerable to compulsive buying? You might want to pause the video here for a moment and then turn it back on to see if you're right. First, low conscientiousness is related to carelessness, making the product attributes more salient than careful budgeting. Also, low conscientiousness is related to less organization, and this includes financial organization, right? Those low in conscientiousness tend to be less aware of their bank account and their credit card balances. Can you think of a very different reason why someone who is high in agreeableness might be especially vulnerable to compulsive buying? Again, you might want to pause the video here. Because of a need to be kind to salespeople, feeling that not buying may be perceived as rude, so having some difficulty saying no.